The air backstage was thick with the smell of old velvet and something like dusty electricity. It was a smell she was starting to know, the smell of big halls and even bigger dreams. From her hiding spot in the wings, the young woman could see the stage, a vast, empty wooden island under a forest of lights. Out there, beyond the edge of the stage, a low rumble of chatter filled the space, the sound of 1,000 people settling into their expensive seats, rustling their programs and waiting for the magic to begin. But for her, there was no magic. There was just a job to do. Her heart was doing a frantic tap dance against her ribs, a nervous rhythm she knew all too well. She clutched the neck of her cello, her fingers tracing the familiar worn spots on the wood. This instrument wasn't just a tool. It was her oldest friend. It had been with her through countless hours of practice in tiny, lonely rooms, through moments of frustration when the notes wouldn't come, and through moments of pure joy when the music felt like it was flowing straight from her soul. It had a small, almost invisible scratch near the scroll, a souvenir from a clumsy fall in her school's orchestra room years ago. She ran her thumb over it now, a small, secret gesture of reassurance. It was her anchor in a sea of overwhelming grandeur. She was just 21, a student at the conservatory, still getting used to the idea that people might actually pay to hear her play. This gig was a fluke, a last-minute call from a desperate stage manager who needed someone reliable to play a short, simple piece before the main event, a warm-up act. That's what they had called her. The words had stung a little, like a small paper cut. She wasn't the star. She was the person who played while the star was getting ready. Her job was to be pleasant background noise, a musical appetizer before the main course. The main course tonight was Maestro Adrian Thorne. His name was everywhere. On the posters in the lobby, on the cover of the program, whispered in the excited conversations of the people filtering into the hall. He was a giant in the world of classical music, a legend who hadn't performed in years. Tonight was a special tribute concert, a one-night-only event to honor his career. The pressure in the building wasn't just for a good performance. It was for a historic one. And she was just the warm, dash-up dot. She peeked through a small gap in the heavy curtain. The hall was magnificent. Gold leaf glinted in the soft light, and the seats seemed to go on forever, a sea of dark suits and colorful dresses. These people didn't come to hear a student play Bach. They came for the maestro. They came to witness greatness. She felt a knot form in her stomach. What was she even doing here? She felt like an imposter, a little girl who had wandered into a party for grown-ups. She imagined them all looking at their watches, bored, waiting for her to be done so the real music could start. A stagehand with a headset walked briskly past her. 5 minutes, kid, he said, not even looking at her. Don't be late. Kid, the word hung in the air. It was exactly how she felt. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic drumming in her chest. She thought back to her tiny apartment, to the single room she practiced in. The walls were thin, and she was always worried about bothering the neighbors. She would stuff towels under the door to muffle the sound, playing late into the night when the world was asleep. In that small room, with just her cello for company, the music was everything. It was her escape, her voice, her dream. But here, in this massive hall, that dream felt both incredibly close and impossibly far away. She looked at her cello again. Okay, old friend, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just you and me. Let's not mess this up. She carefully tightened the bow, her hands, though trembling, knowing exactly what to do. It was a ritual, a familiar dance that brought a sliver of calm. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the notes of the Bach suite she was about to play. It was a beautiful piece, but simple, safe, the kind of music that wouldn't offend anyone. The kind of music that could be easily ignored. The lights in the hall dimmed, and the rumble of the crowd softened to a low hum. A spotlight appeared on the stage right where she was supposed to stand. It was a circle of bright, white light looking almost like a trapdoor to another world. This was it. Her cue was coming. She could feel the eyes of the unseen audience, a collective weight of expectation. They weren't expecting much from her, she knew that. They were just waiting. But for her, this 15 minutes felt like the most important of her life. It was a chance, a small crack in the door to the world she so desperately wanted to join. She took one last, shaky breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The first note felt like a question asked in a huge, empty room. It hung in the air for a second, clear and a little lonely, before finding its place in the vastness of the hall. She had closed her eyes just for a moment to block out the blinding spotlight and the faceless crowd. It was just her and the cello, just like in her small apartment. But it wasn't the same. Here, every note she played had a ghost, an echo that bounced back from the high, distant ceiling. The sound was bigger than she was, bigger than her instrument. It was a strange feeling, like a part of her had been set loose and was now exploring this massive space on its own. Her fingers, which had been clumsy with nerves just minutes before, now knew exactly what to do. They danced across the strings, finding the familiar pathways of the Bach suite. She focused on the music, on the story it was supposed to tell. It was a gentle piece, full of peace and simple beauty. Not the kind of music that would make anyone cry or jump to their feet. It was wallpaper music exactly as they had asked for. She tried to pour a little of her own soul into it, a little of the joy she felt when she played, but it was hard. The pressure to be just okay, to not stand out, was surprisingly heavy. She was so aware of being a placeholder, a human timer counting down the minutes until the real show began. Halfway through, her mind started to wander. She thought about the maestro. What was he doing right now? Was he backstage, listening? Or was he in some special dressing room, sipping water, maybe stretching his famous hands? She imagined him as a figure of calm, a master of his craft, completely at ease. He was probably thinking about his own music, the deep, complicated pieces that had made him a legend. He wasn't thinking about the girl playing the warm-up. No one was. And in a way, that was a relief. It meant she could make a tiny mistake, a slight buzz on a string, and it wouldn't matter. No one would notice. No one cared that much. The thought was both sad and freeing. As she played the final notes, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had done it. She hadn't frozen. She hadn't messed up badly. She had filled her 15 minutes. The last chord faded into the quiet hall, and for a second, there was just silence. Then a sound came. It was applause, but it was the polite, gentle kind of applause you give when someone has finished a task correctly. It wasn't a roar. It was a patter like light rain on a roof. She stood up, gave a quick, nervous bow, and practically scurried off the stage, her cello bumping gently against her back. Back in the wings, the world was different. The hot, bright pressure of the spotlight was replaced by the cool, dim safety of the shadows. She took a deep, shaky breath and let it out. It felt like the first real breath she'd taken all night. Her heart was still beating fast, but now it was a beat of excitement, not fear. She had done it. She had played in the big hall. Carefully, she began to pack her cello into its case. It was a familiar, comforting routine. Loosen the bow, wipe the rosin dust from the strings, lay the instrument gently on its velvet bed. Each action was a small step back to normalcy. From her spot in the wings, she had a perfect view of the stage, but the audience couldn't see her. She was a ghost again, invisible. The lights in the hall went down even further, until it was almost completely dark. A single, tighter spotlight appeared at the center of the stage. The low hum of the crowd died away, replaced by a thick, electric silence. This was it. The moment everyone had been waiting for. A man in a formal suit walked out to the spotlight. It was the concertmaster, the leader of the orchestra. He looked serious and important. He waited for the silence to become absolute, then he began to speak. His voice was smooth and deep, but she couldn't quite make out the words from where she was. She just saw the way he held himself, the way the light glinted off his silver hair. He was introducing the maestro. As he said the name, a wave of sound washed over her from the audience. It wasn't a cheer, it was a gasp, a collective intake of breath, followed by a low, rolling murmur of excitement. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Then, the concertmaster stepped aside, and a new figure walked slowly into the light. It was him, the maestro. He looked smaller than she had imagined, frailer. He walked with a slight stoop, his shoulders rounded as if carrying a great weight. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, but it seemed to hang on him a little. His hair was white, and his face was a map of deep lines. From a distance, he looked every bit the part of the wise old master. But as he got closer to the center of the stage, she saw something else. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a look of profound sadness. Or maybe fear. The moment he appeared, the audience erupted. It wasn't polite applause this time. It was a thunderous roar, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. People were on their feet, clapping with a fierce, desperate energy. They were showing him all the love they had in their hearts, all the admiration they had stored up for years. He stood in the center of the storm, nodding slowly, a small, tired smile on his face. He raised a hand to acknowledge them, a slow, deliberate gesture. But to her, watching from the shadows, it didn't look like a man enjoying a moment of triumph. It looked like a man bracing himself. He finally sat down on the simple chair that had been placed for him. An assistant brought him his instrument, a beautiful violin that seemed to glow in the spotlight. The roar of the crowd softened to a hush. He was going to play. This was the piece, the one he had written for his wife, the one everyone was here to hear. The silence in the hall was so complete, she could hear her own blood pulsing in her ears. He lifted the violin to his shoulder. He raised the bow, and then it happened. His hand, the hand that held the bow, began to tremble. It was a small tremor at first, a slight shakiness that she thought might just be a trick of the light. But it got worse. The bow started to quiver, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. He tried to steady it with his other hand, but it was no use. He held it there, poised over the strings, for what felt like an eternity. The entire audience was leaning forward, holding their breath with him. She could feel their collective will, their silent prayers for him to just play the note, but he see OYODN single quotes. Slowly, painfully, he lowered the bow. He lowered the violin from his shoulder and placed it gently on the floor beside him. He sat there for a moment, his head bowed, a defeated silhouette in the single spotlight. Then he looked up, out at the dark sea of faces. He didn't speak into a microphone, but his voice, though quiet, carried a terrible weight in the silent hall. "I'm sorry," he said. "I cannot." He stood up, gave a small, broken bow, and walked off the stage. Disappearing into the darkness behind her, he left behind a silence that was more deafening than any applause. It was a hollow, shocked emptiness. Out in the hall, no one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, staring at the empty chair and the lonely violin on the floor. Backstage, the quiet calm had shattered. People were whispering into headsets, rushing around with panicked looks on their faces. The concert was falling apart, live in front of 1,000 people, and she stood there, her cello half-packed, forgotten in its case, a witness to the moment a legend broke. The silence that followed the maestro's exit was a heavy, living thing. It wasn't peaceful or quiet. It was a vacuum sucking all the air and life out of the grand hall. From her hiding spot in the wings, the young woman felt it press in on her, a physical weight on her shoulders. Out there, 1,000 people sat in darkness, their faces turned towards the empty stage. They were a single, stunned creature, holding its breath, unable to process what had just happened. The lonely violin still lay on the floor, a symbol of a broken promise. It was the saddest thing she had ever seen. The stillness on stage was a complete lie. Behind her, in the narrow, cluttered space of the wings, all hell had broken loose. It was like a dam had burst, releasing a flood of panicked energy. A man in a very nice suit, probably the event organizer, was pacing back and forth, his face pale and shiny with sweat. He was barking orders into a headset, his voice a strained whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "What do you mean we can't cut to commercial? It's a live broadcast on public radio. There are no commercials." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up completely. "Find him. See if he's okay. Tell him anything. Just get him back on stage." Other people scurried around him like ants whose hill has been kicked. A woman with a clipboard was frantically flipping through pages, as if the solution to this disaster was written somewhere in the schedule. A stagehand was staring at a monitor, his mouth hanging open. The air was thick with tension, with the smell of fear and expensive cologne. Everyone was looking at everyone else, their eyes wide with the same question, what do we do now? The young woman felt a powerful urge to disappear. She quickly snapped the last latch on her cello case, the loud click sounding like a gunshot in the chaos. She just wanted to pick up her case and slip out the back door. She was not part of this. This was a problem for important people, for people who were paid to handle crises. She was just the warm-up, a footnote in a program that was now falling apart. Her job was done. She had played her simple, forgettable piece and survived. To stay felt like an intrusion, like watching a private family argument through a window. She slung the heavy case over her shoulder, wincing as it dug into her back. She took a step towards the exit, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear, the fear of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But just as she was about to melt into the shadows, a figure stepped in front of her, blocking her path. It was the concertmaster, the man who had introduced the maestro. Up close, he looked older, more tired. The stage lights had hidden the deep worry lines around his eyes. He wasn't looking at her as a person, but as an object, a potential solution to a terrible problem. His eyes scanned her, then her cello case, and then back to her face. There was a desperate, calculating look in them. "You're still here," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low and rough. "I was just leaving," she stammered, taking a small step back. "My part is over." He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "No one's part is over until we find a way to finish this show." He looked over his shoulder towards the stage, where the organizer was now having a quiet, frantic argument with another man in a suit. "He can't come back out." "Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. But we can't just, end it, not like this. Not with the radio live." "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but I don't see what I can do." She tightened her grip on the handle of her cello case. A physical barrier between her and his desperation. The concertmaster took a step closer, lowering his voice even more. "I saw you earlier today, in one of the rehearsal rooms. You were playing something, difficult?" He paused, searching her face. "It was the maestro's piece, wasn't it? The elegy for Clara?" Her blood ran cold. It felt like he had reached into her soul and pulled out her biggest secret. The elegy was the maestro's masterpiece, a piece of music so personal and so emotionally raw that it was rarely played by anyone else. She had found a copy of the sheet music in the library, a dusty old manuscript that someone had forgotten to check back in. She had been drawn to it, to the story behind it, a love song written for a wife who had died too soon. She had learned it in secret, in the dead of night in her small apartment. It was her private obsession, a way to connect with the music she loved on a deeper level. She had never played it for anyone, not even her teachers. It felt too personal, too sacred, like reading someone else's diary. I was just messing around with it," she lied, her cheeks flushing with heat. "I could never play it properly. Can you play it now?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no room for excuses in his gaze. It was a direct, raw plea. "The notes. Do you know the notes?" She opened her mouth to say no. Every fiber of her being was screaming at her to refuse. It was insane. It was a terrible idea. She was a student. He was a legend. To play his most personal music in his place after he had just broken down on stage? It was more than just a bad idea. It was a sacrilege. She would be a joke. The critics would tear her apart. The audience would be angry. She would be humiliating herself and disrespecting the maestro all at once. But then she looked past the concertmaster, out at the dark, silent hall. She thought about the people sitting out there. They hadn't come to see a disaster. They had come for beauty, for a moment of connection, for a chance to share in the maestro's genius. They came to remember, to feel, to be a part of something special. And now all they had was this hollow, awkward silence. She thought about the maestro, the look of utter defeat in his eyes as he walked off the stage. He hadn't just failed to play a piece of music. He had failed to share a piece of his soul. The thought of that, of a story left untold, a feeling left unexpressed, was a different kind of pain. The concertmaster must have seen the conflict in her eyes. He softened his tone just a little. "Look," he said, his voice gentler now. "I'm not asking you to be him. No one can be him. I'm just asking you to fill the silence. To give them something. To give him something. He's backstage right now, and he thinks he's let everyone down. Maybe, just maybe, hearing his music, seeing it honored, would be a kindness." The word kindness hung in the air. It wasn't about being a hero or a star. It was about being human. It was about trying to fix something that was broken. She thought about the elegy. She knew every note, every pause, every dynamic shift. She knew it not just in her fingers, but in her heart. In her lonely room, she hadn't just played the notes. She had poured her own feelings into it, her own loneliness, her own hopes, her own secret heartaches. She had made it her own, just a little. She looked from the desperate face of the concertmaster to the empty stage, a circle of light waiting for someone to step into it. The weight of the cello case on her back suddenly felt different. It wasn't just an instrument she was carrying. It was a possibility. A terrifying, impossible, crazy possibility. The voices in her head were still screaming at her to run, to say no, to save herself. But underneath the screaming, there was a tiny, quiet whisper. A whisper that asked, what if? What if she could do it? What if, just for a moment, she could use the music to bridge that gap between the stage and the audience, to offer a little comfort in the midst of all that disappointment? It was the craziest, most frightening thought she had ever had. But as she stood there, in the middle of all that chaos and despair, it was also the only thought that made any sense. She couldn't find the words to say yes. Her throat was too tight, her heart beating too fast. So she just looked at the concertmaster, at the desperate hope in his eyes, and she nodded. It was a small, almost invisible movement, but it changed everything. A wave of relief washed over his face. He didn't smile. He just nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. He turned and gestured towards the stage. Her walk to the exit was over. A new walk was just beginning. The walk back to the stage was the longest walk of her life. It was only a few dozen steps from the shadows of the wings to the single, waiting spotlight, but it felt like crossing a vast, empty country. The heavy cello case on her back was no longer a comforting weight. It felt like a lead anchor, pulling her down. The concertmaster had gently taken it from her, his hands moving quickly to unfasten the latches and free her instrument. Now she carried only the cello itself, its smooth wood cool against her neck. It was both a shield and a terrible responsibility. As she stepped into the light, a low murmur rippled through the dark hall. It was the sound of 1,000 people asking the same question at once. Who was she? Where was the maestro? She could feel their confusion, their disappointment like a cold wind. She was not the legend they had paid to see. She was a stranger, an unknown, a placeholder for a hero who had fallen. Her first instinct was to turn and run, to flee back into the safety of the wings. But her feet kept moving, one after the other. Carrying her towards the center of the empty stage, she reached the simple wooden chair and sat down. The position so familiar it was almost automatic. She settled the cello against her body, its curve fitting perfectly into her shoulder. For a moment she just sat there, breathing. In and out. In and out. She tried to quiet the storm in her head, the voices screaming that she was an imposter, that this was a mistake. She looked out at the audience, but she couldn't see individual faces anymore. They were just a single, dark mass, a silent, waiting sea. But it didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt sad. They were all sharing a moment of collective disappointment, and she was a part of it. She wasn't just playing for them. She was playing with them. She closed her eyes. She blocked out the light, the hall, the expectations. She thought of her small apartment, the worn spot on the carpet where she always sat to practice. She remembered the stolen copy of the elegy, the notes that had seemed to leap off the page and into her heart. She had played this piece 100 times, but never for anyone. It was her private language, a way to speak the feelings she couldn't put into words. In that moment, she made a decision. She wasn't going to try to be the maestro. She couldn't. She was just going to play her own truth through his notes. She raised the bow. Her hand was shaking, a slight, visible tremor. She took one last, deep breath and let the first note hang in the air. It was not a perfect note. It was a little hesitant, a little fragile, like a bird taking its first flight. A wave of confusion washed over the audience. This was not the powerful, confident opening they were used to. This was something else. Something vulnerable. But as the note faded, another followed, and then another. Slowly, carefully, she began to weave the melody of the elegy. Her fingers, which had felt stiff and clumsy, began to remember the pathways they had traveled so many times in secret. At first, she was just playing the notes, her mind racing, her body tense with fear. She was hyper-aware of every sound, every creak of her chair, every rustle from the audience. But then something shifted. As she moved deeper into the piece, the music started to take over. It was no longer a series of tasks for her fingers to perform. It became a story. A feeling. She stopped thinking and started listening. Listening to the music she was creating, to the conversation between the bow and the strings. She wasn't just playing the maestro's grief for his lost wife. She was playing her own loneliness, a long night spent practicing in a room that felt too big for one person. She was playing her own fears, the terror of not being good enough, the constant worry that her dream was just a silly fantasy. She poured all of it into the cello, all the unspoken words and hidden feelings. The music became a river, and she was just a boat, letting it carry her where it wanted to go. The audience felt the change. The confusion in the hall began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, intense focus. They leaned forward in their seats, not as critics, but as fellow travelers on this emotional journey. They realized this wasn't a technical performance. This was an act of sharing. This young woman, the stranger, was opening up her soul to them. She was offering them not the polished perfection of a legend, but the raw, honest beauty of a human heart. A few people in the front rows began to quietly wipe their eyes. The silence in the hall was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. The music began to swell, rising in intensity like a gathering storm. Her body moved with it, swaying gently, her eyes still closed. Her bow arm, which had been trembling with nerves, now moved with a newfound strength and purpose. She was no longer just playing the cello. She was one with it. The instrument was an extension of her voice, singing the song she could never have spoken aloud. The notes poured out of her, a torrent of sound that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. It was the sound of loss, but also of hope. The sound of pain, but also of incredible strength. This was the climax of the piece. The moment where all the emotion came to a head. She played with everything she had, her muscles burning, her breath coming in short gasps. It was an outpouring, a release of all the pressure she had been feeling for months, for years. In that moment, she wasn't a student or a warm-up act. She was a musician in the truest sense of the word. She was a conduit for something pure and powerful, something that connected her to every single person in that hall. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. She played the final, soft notes, a gentle whisper that hung in the air for a moment before disappearing into the silence. The last vibration of the strings faded away, and the hall was plunged into a profound, absolute stillness. It was a sacred silence, a shared moment of reverence. No one wanted to be the first to break it. She sat there, her bow still resting on the strings, her body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. She slowly opened her eyes, as if waking from a dream. The silence held for a full 10 seconds. Then, a single person in the back row began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Then another joined in, and another. Suddenly, the dam broke. The hall erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar, a cathartic explosion of sound that seemed to shake the very walls. People were on their feet, their faces wet with tears, clapping with a fierce, desperate joy. They were not just clapping for a performance. They were clapping for courage, for honesty, for the unexpected beauty they had just witnessed. She stared out at the standing ovation, her mind blank with shock. She had never experienced anything like it. Slowly, awkwardly, she stood up and gave a clumsy bow. She wasn't a polished performer accepting an award. She was a young woman who had just given everything she had and was overwhelmed by the response. As she straightened up, she saw a figure standing in the wings, just out of the spotlight. It was the maestro. He was watching her, his face no longer filled with defeat, but with a look of quiet, profound gratitude. And in that moment she knew. She hadn't just filled a silence. She had started a new song. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a wall of sound that pressed against her, making it hard to breathe. It was a sound she had only ever heard in her dreams, a sound reserved for other people, for people like the maestro. But it was for her. The thought was so big, so impossible, that her mind couldn't quite hold on to it. She stood there in the circle of light, her cello still in her hands, and stared out at the sea of people on their feet. Their faces were blurry, indistinct shapes, but she could feel their energy, a wave of pure, unfiltered emotion washing over her. It was joy, it was relief, it was gratitude. It was 1,000 people releasing a breath they didn't know they were holding. Her body felt numb, disconnected. Her fingers ached, her arm throbbed, and her ears were ringing. She felt a trickle of sweat run down her temple, but she couldn't move to wipe it away. The concertmaster was at her side now, gently taking her arm and guiding her to bow again. She did, awkwardly, her body moving on its own. The roar got even louder. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and wonderful all at once. She had never been the center of so much attention, and she felt a strange mix of wanting to soak it all in and wanting to become invisible again. Finally, the concertmaster led her off the stage, back into the cool darkness of the wings. The moment she was out of the spotlight, the noise of the crowd softened, muffled by the heavy curtains. The world snapped back into sharp focus. The frantic energy from before had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't panic. It was excitement. The man in the nice suit, the event organizer, rushed up to her, his face flushed with relief and joy. He was talking a mile a minute, words tumbling out of him. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. I don't know how you did it, but you saved us. You saved the whole night. He grabbed her hand and shook it, his grip surprisingly strong. She just stood there, letting him shake it, unable to form a coherent sentence. The concertmaster was there too, a quiet, steady presence amidst the chaos. He just smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. He didn't say anything, but his look said more than words ever could. It was a look of respect, of acknowledgement. It was the look of one musician recognizing something special in another. People were patting her on the back, congratulating her, calling her a hero. It was all a blur. She felt like she was floating, watching this happen to someone else. Her only anchor was the cello she still held, its familiar weight a reminder of what had just transpired. Through the swarm of people she saw him. He was standing a little ways off, in the deepest part of the shadows, just watching. The maestro. The crowd's noise seemed to fade away completely, and all she could see was his face. He looked different. The frailty and defeat were gone, replaced by a look of quiet clarity. His eyes, which had been so full of pain earlier, were now clear and focused, fixed on her. The organizer and the concertmaster seemed to notice him too, and they parted like a sea, creating a path for him to walk through. He moved slowly, deliberately towards her. Her heart, which had just started to slow down, began to beat wildly again. This was it. The moment of judgment. He was the one who mattered. His opinion was the only one that could truly validate or destroy what she had just done. She felt a surge of the old fear, the feeling of being an imposter. What if he was angry? What if he thought she had disrespected his music, his grief? He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his gaze searching hers. Then his eyes dropped to the cello in her hands. He slowly reached out a hand and gently touched the wood as if it were something sacred. His touch was light, almost reverent. "You didn't just play the notes," he said. His voice was quiet, a little rough, but it carried an immense weight. "You understood them." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She shook her head, unable to speak. I was so scared," she finally managed to whisper. He gave a small, sad smile. "I know, that's why it was beautiful." He looked back up at her face. "That piece, that elegy, it's not just music, it's a conversation. For 30 years I've been having that conversation with her. Every time I played it, she was there. But tonight I couldn't find her voice. The silence was too loud." He paused, his gaze distant for a moment, lost in a memory. "But you found a way to speak. You weren't trying to imitate my voice. You used your own, and it was honest. It was the most honest performance I have ever heard." He took her hand then. His hand was old and thin, but his grip was firm. "You didn't just fill the silence," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave it meaning. You gave her a voice tonight when I could not." "Thank you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. It was all the validation she needed, more than she could have ever dreamed of. She wasn't an imposter. She hadn't been a replacement. She had been a messenger. A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. He gently let go of her hand and gave a small, respectful bow to her. Before turning and disappearing back into the shadows, the rest of the night passed in a daze. Someone helped her pack her cello. Someone else gave her a bottle of water. She signed a few autographs for stagehands who asked, her hand shaking so much she could barely form the letters. She felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settle in, the kind that comes after a great storm has passed. She finally managed to slip away, out a back door and into the cool night air. The city was quiet. The contrast with the chaos inside the hall was jarring. She walked for a long time, just holding her cello case, not really knowing where she was going. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, the terror, the music, the silence, the ovation, and finally, the maestro's words. It felt like a lifetime had passed in just a few hours. She was no longer the same person who had walked into the hall that afternoon, nervous and full of self-doubt. Something had shifted inside her, a fundamental change. The fear was still there, a familiar companion, but it no longer had power over her. It had been replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. The next morning, she woke up late in her small apartment. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, a vivid fantasy born from too much practice and not enough sleep. But then she saw her cello case leaning against the wall, and she knew it was real. Her hands were sore, her muscles ached. She got up and walked to the corner store, still in her clothes from the night before. She bought a newspaper, her heart pounding. On the front page of the arts section was a picture of her, head bowed, lost in the music on the stage. The headline was simple and direct. "An unknown star is born in a moment of tragedy." She read the review as she walked back to her apartment, her eyes scanning the words. The critic wrote about her raw, breathtaking honesty, her fearless vulnerability, and the profound connection she had made with the audience. It wasn't just a good review. It was a declaration. As she walked in her door, her phone began to ring. It was the conservatory. Then her agent. Then a number she didn't recognize. The world, it seemed, had finally noticed her. She answered the phone, a small smile playing on her lips. The warm-up was over. Her performance was just beginning.